During the Viking Age, there was one route that the Norwegians, and later on after Iceland was discovered, also the Icelanders had mostly to themselves, and that was the route across the northern part of the Atlantic. During several hundred years, these Norsemen, they sailed further and further to the west. And during that time, islands were discovered and settled. First the Faroe Island, then Iceland, and after that, Greenland. And as a logical consequence of this movement all the time towards the west, America was discovered. It had to be discovered.
In this great ocean, many have found still another island which is called Vinland, since there grow wild grapes. But beyond, everything is filled with intolerable ice and terrible fog. These are the words of Adam of Bremen, written in the year 1070. He was describing the islands of the northern seas that had been discovered and settled by the Norsemen. Today, the most important records of that culture are kept in Reykjavik, Iceland. The Icelandic sagas are the history of a people, a record of colonization, of kings and parliaments and laws, of pagan and Christian religions, of bitter feuds and battles, and great feats of seamanship. These manuscripts are 700 years old, but the stories they tell are much older. For hundreds of years, they had been passed from one generation to another by word of mouth. Scattered within them are references to a place called Vinland, a place beyond Iceland, beyond Greenland, where the Norse had settled. A landfall further west where few had been. Most places mentioned in the sagas could be identified, but Vinland remained a mystery. The only clues to its location were to be found in just two of the sagas, the Greenlander Saga and the Saga of Eric the Red. Eric was born around the year 950. He was brought as a child to Iceland by his father, a man who had been banished from Norway for manslaughter. He grew up like his father, a harsh man in harsh times, and after quarrels and killings was declared an outlaw by Iceland's parliament. He was forced to abandon the home he had built, to live as a fugitive or flee into exile. He chose to sail beyond the reach of his enemies. He had heard tales of a land to the west, and it was to there that he sailed. For 3 years he explored the new land, then returned to Iceland to bring settlers. He called the place Greenland to make it sound attractive. This is Eriksfjord, where he built his new home, Brathalid. It was from here that his son Leif was to set out on voyages to the place he was to call Vinland. And it was to these same fjords that Dr. Helge Ingstad and his wife Anna Stina came in 1953 from their native Norway in a tiny boat. They were here to trace the journeys of the Norsemen who had come to Greenland so long before them.
The discovery of the North America by Leif Erikson and all the Norsemen had always been in my mind, and I'd written something about it before too. So I was particularly interested in looking at the site of Erik the Red and Leif Erikson. But beside this, it was an extremely fascinating thing to see the whole settlement along the old Norse settlement along the coast.
The Greenlander's Saga tells a story about Barney Harolfsson, caught in a storm on his first voyage from Iceland to Greenland. For days, unable to navigate, swept before the storm, lost, fighting to keep his ship afloat. When the sea had calmed and the mists cleared, he found himself near a shoreline unlike the Greenland he'd been told of. He knew from the height of the sun over his gunwale that he was too far south, so he headed north for some days, then turned east and finally came to Greenland. When the Norsemen there heard his story, some of them set off under Leif Erikson to retrace Barney's route to this new land. Leif built some houses and spent a winter there, then returned to Greenland. The saga tells of further attempts to settle Vinland, the name Leif had given the place because there he said he had found wild grapes. The last recorded attempt was made by Thorfinn Karlsevne and his wife Gudrid. These settlers stayed for several years, and children were born there. But in Vinland there were native people, whom the Norse called Skraelings, and conflicts arose which led to deaths. Outnumbered, the Norsemen fled, never to return. In 1858, a Greenland Eskimo painted these pictures. They tell an Inuit folktale about a fatal encounter with the Norsemen in Greenland. It begins with a group of Inuit finding a strange house at the end of a fjord. As they approached, a group of Kadlunaks, or foreigners, emerged from the house. They were Norsemen, and at first, the story goes, the Inuit were afraid of them. But the Norsemen seemed friendly, and for a time, a cautious but peaceful relationship existed between the two groups. But after a while, fear and suspicion grew. And one day, when the Inuit men were away hunting, the Norsemen attacked their camp and slaughtered many of the women and children. When the hunters returned, they were overcome by grief and anger and planned their revenge. They built a boat and camouflaged it with bleached sealskins. The Norsemen saw the boat but thought it was only an ice floe. The Inuit landed, crept up to the houses, and set fire to them. All but one of the Norsemen who escaped the fire were killed by arrows. The one managed to get to a boat and sailed away. From that day on, no Norsemen were ever seen in that fjord again.